There are moments, after all these years of watching The Young and the Restless, when I find myself leaning back in my chair, not just as a viewer but as someone who has lived alongside these characters for decades, and I ask a simple question. How is it that this show still manages to unsettle me, not with spectacle alone, but with the quiet, calculated cruelty of human choices? The current storyline involving Victor Newman, Phyllis Summers, and Patty Williams is, in my view, one of those arcs that reminds us why we never truly left Genoa City, even after all these years. I have followed Victor Newman long enough to understand that he does not act impulsively. Age has not softened him, it has refined him. If anything, he has become more dangerous precisely because he now prefers indirection over confrontation. So when the story reveals that Victor has quietly uncovered a secret held by Phyllis, one capable of shaking the Newman Empire to its core, I was not surprised that he chose not to strike immediately. No, Victor never wastes a weapon when he can turn someone else into one. And that, to me, is where the moral center of this storyline begins to darken in a deeply unsettling way. Why Patty? That is the question that lingered in my mind at first, though the answer came quickly. Patty is not just vulnerable, she is history incarnate. She carries wounds that never properly healed, and Victor, ever the strategist, understands that pain is often more powerful than loyalty. Offering her money is almost irrelevant. What he truly offers is something far more seductive: release. The promise of being freed from her past, from the voices, from the chaos within her own mind. But is that promise ever real when it comes from Victor? Of course not. And yet, we understand why Patty hesitates, why she trembles at the edge before stepping into the abyss. Haven't we all, at some point in life, been tempted to believe in an easier ending? What I find particularly compelling is how the show takes its time with Patty's transformation. She does not immediately become a villain in action, she becomes one in thought first. Victor plants the seed, but it is Patty's own unresolved trauma that waters it. When he reframes Phyllis as the architect of her suffering, he is not inventing a lie so much as reshaping a truth. That is far more dangerous. And so we watch, perhaps with a quiet sense of dread, as Patty begins to observe Phyllis, studying her routines, her solitude, her vulnerabilities. There is something chillingly intimate about this surveillance, something that reminds us how thin the line is between obsession and purpose. The kidnapping itself, when it happens, is almost inevitable, and yet, it is not triumphant. It is messy, chaotic, human. Patty is not a professional. She is a fractured soul trying to carry out a plan far beyond her emotional capacity. When Phyllis fights back, and of course she does, because Phyllis has always been a survivor, the illusion collapses almost immediately. This is not the clean, controlled act Victor envisioned. This is panic. This is blood. This is consequence. And here is where the storyline, in my opinion, becomes truly fascinating. Because while Victor continues his performance in the outside world playing the concerned ally, the man willing to help find Phyllis, we are invited to witness the unraveling happening in that hidden space where Patty holds her captive. It becomes less a crime story and more a psychological duel. Phyllis, even in captivity, refuses to surrender control. She observes Patty just as Patty once observed her. She listens, she adapts, and gradually she begins to do what she has always done best: manipulate. Is it wrong to admire Phyllis in these moments? I have asked myself that more than once. She is, after all, a deeply flawed character, capable of her own brand of ruthlessness. But there is something undeniably compelling about her resilience. She recognizes that Patty is not entirely stable, that the real leverage lies not in physical escape, but in mental disruption. And so she begins to plant her own seeds: doubt about Victor, questions about his intentions, subtle reminders that Patty is merely a pawn in a much larger game. What unfolds is almost Shakespearean in its tension. Patty, already fragile, begins to fracture further. The voices return, or perhaps they never left. The distinction hardly matters. What matters is that she starts to lose her grip on reality, and with that loss comes danger. Real danger. Not the calculated threat of Victor Newman, but the unpredictable volatility of a mind at war with itself. At this point, I found myself less concerned with who would win, and more concerned with who would survive. And then comes the moment that for me, defines this entire arc. Patty's realization that Victor never intended to honor his promise. It is a brief flicker of clarity, but it changes everything. In that instant, Patty is no longer merely a tool. She becomes a variable Victor cannot fully control. Her decision to confront him directly, to demand his presence under threat of exposure, is both desperate and strangely empowering. It is the act of someone who finally sees the truth, even if only for a moment. Victor's response, of course, is entirely in character. He agrees to meet, but not out of compassion or responsibility. He comes to clean up the mess. That is who he has always been, and perhaps who he will always be. Yet even he, with all his foresight, fails to anticipate one crucial detail. Phyllis is still playing the game. The revelation that she has recorded the conversation is not just a plot twist, it is a statement, a reminder that even in her most vulnerable state, she remains formidable. And just when it seems that everything is about to collapse, truth exposed, alliances shattered, justice imminent, the story pulls back once more. The arrival of the police should signal resolution. Instead, we are left with absence. Patty disappears. Not dramatically, not with spectacle, but quietly, almost eerily. And with her goes a piece of the truth, a piece of accountability that may never fully surface. What does that leave us with? That is the question I find myself returning to. For longtime viewers, especially those of us who have grown older alongside these characters, there is a certain poignancy in recognizing that resolution is rarely complete. The past lingers. Secrets remain partially buried. And people flawed, complicated, painfully human people continue to make choices that ripple outward in ways they cannot control. I will admit, there are aspects of this storyline that trouble me. Victor's manipulation of Patty feels particularly cruel, even by his standards. One might argue that the show risks repeating a familiar pattern using mental instability as a narrative device. But I would also argue that, in this case, there is an effort to explore the consequences more deeply. Patty is not simply a villain, she is a casualty. And that distinction matters. At the same time, Phyllis's role raises its own questions. Is she a victim, a survivor, or something in between? Perhaps that ambiguity is precisely the point. In Genoa City, identity is rarely fixed. People evolve, regress, contradict themselves. That is what has kept this show alive for so many years, and what continues to draw us back. As I reflect on this arc, I cannot help but think about the audience, those of us who have been here for decades, who have seen these characters at their best and their worst. There is a shared history that adds weight to every glance, every decision, every betrayal. We are not just watching a story, we are remembering all the stories that came before it. And so I find myself asking, perhaps a bit wistfully, what comes next? Will Patty resurface, carrying with her the missing pieces of the truth? Will Victor face consequences, or will he once again find a way to reshape the narrative in his favor? And what of Phyllis? Will this ordeal change her, or simply reinforce the instincts that have always defined her? I do not have definitive answers, and in a way, I am grateful for that. Because uncertainty, when handled well, is the lifeblood of a show like this. It keeps us engaged, questioning, invested. It reminds us that even after all these years, The Young and the Restless still has the power to surprise us not just with what happens, but with how deeply we feel about it.